Again, Temple, welcome. It's a great opportunity to have you here today. As I said, the visit that you've just had is Indonesia and Australia. You've looked at in particular, the live export supply chain, and was just interested to see and hear your thoughts on what you've seen. There is an enormous amount of detail, as I mentioned, in the overall process.
All I like to do is to fly overhead, but then I get down in the weeds and then I go back up again.
Well, that's what we're looking for. Okay. We're looking for more of the overhead and a little less of the weeds, but happy to hear your opinion.
Well,
so if we start in Australia, Temple, if we could,
okay.
and just by way of information.
Well, first of all, I just, animal rights people have been contacting me, so I'm going to answer this question right up front. Maybe you just showed me the good places.
Say it again, animal rights.
Animal rights people have already contacted me. Yep. And they're going to say you just showed me the good places. But at least one thing that shows is it shows that doing things right really is possible. Let's start out with the stations. One of the things that really struck me was how vast it is. There's only one way to raise food out there on that land, and that's livestock. You know, this is where an airplane is your car, and it stops at the self-service gas pump in Catherine, so we could get back.
Just let me interrupt you just for a second, Temple. This is an interesting concept, I suppose, for people who aren't used to it. Temple's emphasised the vastness of what she's seen, but she was highly impressed with the fact that you can fly in an aeroplane, single engine, twin engine, pull up at a BP air fuel, put your card in and get fuel and fly off to wherever it was you were going to.
You don't do that at home, I can assure you of that. But what that shows is the vastness. You know, it's like as if the whole interior of the U.S. was just used for grazing. You know, we have to raise food off this land. And I watched some cattle handling. For the most part, I was really pleased with that. There was one little problem with the calf race that was too wide, and the calves turned around in it. That would just be minor. One of the things I looked at on the stations is body condition. I like simple indicators, simple things I can look at, similar to what was on the previous speaker's chart. Cattle looked good. They were not wild. I was pretty much pleased with what I saw out on the stations. And then we didn't get to see any loading going out onto a boat, but I did get to see some cattle that were ready to go on a boat, very tame and gentle, good body condition. You know, that's the good news. Then we get out to Indonesia. Actually, I went there first, went to 2 feed yards, one that was a semi-covered concrete floor, another one with a roof over the whole thing, concrete floor. And I look at things I consider critical control points, things I can directly observe. Yes, I'm going to get in the weeds on this, because it's stuff that I can see, and if I had gone into that feed yard and there was a bunch of filthy, dirty cattle in there, well, that somebody ought to fail an audit. Most of the cattle I saw in the feed yards were clean. I was pleased about that. There were a few dirty pens about this deep in muck that needed to be cleaned. On your system here, that would be major. You have to fix it, but nothing that would get somebody kicked off the approved supplier list. So dirty animals, I looked at that. Now I want to talk about another problem that I want to make sure we don't get, and that's lameness and swollen joints. In many parts of the world, Holstein cattle in the dairies have horrible problems with swollen joints. You're working right now on improved breeds of cattle. Be careful. I do not want swollen joints and lameness to get started on those concrete floor feed yards. We need to be measuring that. Ammonia levels need to be measured. That was good. Gentle cattle, flight zone was small. Another thing, of course, water and heat stress. Here's a simple way to measure heat stress, and it's scientifically documented. Open mouth breathing. And all the cattle I saw everywhere were breathing with their mouths closed. When cattle open the mouth, the tongue starts to come out, you're in severe heat stress. That's easier to measure than trying to count respiration rate. Those mouths are open. When they're at rest, they are hot. And for the most part, I was happy what I saw there. Now we get to slaughter. That's the big issue that caused the mess in 2011. And I saw quite a few cattle stunned with the non-penetrating captive bolt. That seemed to work well. I also saw an animal with no head do very vigorous reflexes. There's no way it could be conscious. It had no head. But what that showed is that the slaughtering can be done right. I cannot emphasize enough stunner gun maintenance.
Fantastic. Well,
so that's just a very quick overview. But my approach to welfare is there's certain critical control points, things like filthy, dirty cattle, heat stress symptoms, then, of course, handling, scoring. We need to score handling. I noticed a beautiful video back there showing good handling. And what I have found is that there's some people, you go out and they go to a low-stress cattle handling workshop, about 20% stay good. A light goes on in their head and they just get it. Everybody else, we've got to monitor it, just like the police have to monitor speeding out on the highway with speed cameras. So you measure handling. How many animals fell down during handling? Okay, we're handling the animals at the slaughterhouse in the restraint box. Does it vocalize? Because if it's vocalizing in the restraint box, you're hurting it. Or does it vocalize when you catch it with the head bail? If it vocalizes, you're hurting it. How fast cattle are going. Are they running into things? Electric jigger use. These are things I can measure. And then I can tell, is handling getting better or handling getting worse? Because we've got to make sure all of these things, we do not get bad becoming normal. And that's what happened in our dairy industry with lameness and swollen legs. We do have a few really good dairies that have corrected that. But we've got to make sure on the swollen legs and lameness that that problem does not get started on these concrete floor feed yards.
So Temple, let me take you back just for a brief period to what you saw on property in Australia, on the stations. You mentioned you've been in Australia many times before.
Yes, I have.
But this is the first opportunity to look at what you would call it the outback.
We're in the deep outback. This is my first trip.
Correct.
And just looking out that window into this expanse. I mean, you go in an airliner at 30,000 feet in the U.S., I can see the farmland down below and see signs of civilization. As far as I can see, there's nothing, and then all of a sudden there's a cattle station there like an oasis out in that vastness.
And you've talked previously about sustainability within the industry, both in the way we operate on the properties, etc., and the way we handle cattle, all those issues that lead to a good sustainable industry. And I'd be interested in your view, I guess, on what the best utilisation is for this vastness that you see.
There's only one way to raise food on this land. We've got to raise food on this land, and that's grazing animals of various types. This is a very unique situation. You cannot grow crops on this land. What do we do, just leave it vacant? I don't think so. I was also pleased to see when I went to Indonesia, the cattle all being fed byproducts. They're not competing with people for food. They're eating things that were just thrown away, various residues from the palm oil industry and other things.
Okay. And back in Australia again, the operations that you saw, the particular properties that you saw, I mean, what was your view on the ongoing sustainability of those particular operations?
Well, I realized that I saw it the worst possible time of year. Very dry, but compared to things I've experienced in the Arizona desert, and I lived in the Arizona desert for 10 years, there's feed out there in those pastures, a lot more than the Arizona desert has. You have this huge piece of land that's half the area of the United States where grazing animals is the only way you can raise food on it. When you got sustainability, then you get, animal welfare issues, but we've got to be raising food on that land.
I'm not too sure, moving slightly off the property, I'm not too sure whether you had the opportunity to look at any of the transport of livestock.
I did not. I was not able to watch a ship being loaded. Now, in early 80s, I did a project for the Australian government on looking at sheep being shipped out, and I saw some really bad handling at one place, screaming and yelling, and they were doing jumping jacks. And then I went out to Fremantle and watched them load ships out there, and it was fine. They were doing a very good job of handling. See, it gets back to management. Management's got to be behind doing things like handling right. And I have found in doing many workshops that if your manager's not behind you, then the employees are not going to get trained. And when I originally worked on an audit program for McDonald's, we found that out of 75 big slaughterhouses, only 3 had to build fancy facilities. And there also were 3 where the plant manager had to be removed because nothing changed until the attitude got changed.
And getting to the issue that's on everybody's minds on a very regular basis, there's been a lot of emphasis on it here at this particular conference. Welfare and start on property in Australia. Your thoughts there? Well,
absolutely. There's certain critical control points where I'm going to fail you. Okay, you've got your 3 levels there. If I went out to a property and there was a bunch of bone rack body score 1s, I saw a few cattle that were thin. I think there's some things we can do to train some of these picky eaters to get better about what they go out and eat. If I went out and saw a bunch of black Angus cattle out there, mouths wide open, somebody's going to fail an audit, they shouldn't be there. You know, these are things that there's sort of critical control points that you have that step 3 level. It's like, this better get fixed now or you're off the approved supplier list. Then you've got a lot of things on record keeping. But what concerns me is I'm getting very worried that a lot of this audit stuff turns into a whole bunch of paperwork, and the lameness has gradually gotten up to the 10% level in Indonesia. The lameness level in Indonesia right now is probably 1/4%. It's super good. I want to make sure we stay out of trouble because I'm worried about improved cattle possibly getting into trouble. If I went into Indonesia, dirty cattle, heat stress symptoms, sores on the cattle, ammonia levels. They've got to make sure in those roofed buildings they put ridge vents in, big ridge vents in, on a fully roofed yard, or you're going to have ammonia problems.
So let me move to the feedlots in a second.
Okay.
If I could just stay for a minute with the on property, because it's a logical progression. We've talked about welfare on property and the things you saw there. Going back slightly to the point which basically gets around breeding of livestock in this country, but more so in northern Australia. I mean, the crossbred animal in Australia has an impact. The benefit of hybrid vigor is enormous.
There's good things with crossbreds.
And that's what I'd like to ask you about.
I'm not saying you shouldn't use like the Senepal Brahmin crossbred. I'm not saying not to use crossbreds. What we have to do is go for optimal. And oftentimes, what I do not want to see the mistake that our pig industry made in the 80s, they bred for 3 traits: thin back fat, big loins, and rapid gain, and they ended up with horrendous leg conformation. We've got some fancy cattle in the U.S. where they're breeding just for carcass traits. They're getting problems like post-legged, crooked claw, things like this. I want to make sure we avoid these problems. Yes, a crossbred is probably going to work fine. Yes, and it gains better. I saw that data. It was a very, very interesting presentation. But I just want to make sure, because there's always trade-offs, if we push it too hard on the crossbreds, I don't want to see lameness creeping up on those concrete-floored feed yards. And I want to start measuring that now so that we stay out of trouble. You see, we have to figure out how to optimize systems. The mistake is people don't know when to stop. And this is what happened with Holstein dairy cow.
Mm-hmm. And I guess another question in relation to scale of livestock in the individual livestock I'm referring to here. The US has been there and retreated in the area of very large livestock to the extent, we're at the Denver Stock Show. I've been there, you've been there.
Oh, I've been there, and I saw some really awful feet and legs there too.
Yeah, on the other side of the animal. I mean, are you seeing that? Do you think you're seeing that in Australia? Do you think you saw it in your travels?
Now, I did not see any sign of leg conformation issues. I was very, very pleased with legs. Then every slide that was put up here that had a picture, I was looking at that. I just want to make sure we stay out of trouble on that.
Sure.
Because our pig industry got in a bunch of trouble with it. I'm seeing certain fancy cattle. I don't think I want to say whose cattle they are. I'm starting to see problems with things like crooked claw. That's a defect. It's not okay. We can use crossbred animals. That's fine. But don't push it too far. That's the thing we got to be careful about, because we have cattle on concrete feed yards at home, and we got swollen legs and problems with them, especially if they've kept on the concrete too long and the feed is fed too hot. What's too hot? High energy feed. I'm going with the outcomes. They better breathe with their mouth closed. You better keep them clean, and they better have not be lame and not have swollen joints.
And I guess the question I would ask you is, based on what you've seen in Australia with livestock, we have a very, very different, rangeland system to that you have in the US. It's, as you said, it's
gigantic. Like you've got Waterhole with 500 head of cattle around it. That's a family ranch at home. So each one of these stations is like 25 or 30 family ranchers.
Yep.
We have some big operations, but it's just not on the same scale.
Yep.
I mean, that is where I think in pictures, so I'm seeing this vista. You know what else I'm seeing? I'm seeing the Apple phone on the dashboard of the plane, and he's talking on the Bluetooth and going like this, and I'm seeing that gas.
And you're looking out the window.
Yes, and I'm looking at the altimeter to make sure we don't go up and do suffocate or something. Yeah, I saw talking on the phone while flying.
Going up and suffocating is less likely than going down and coming to a sudden landing.
He was a great pilot,
Yep.
but I thought maybe I ought to take a picture of that cell phone on the dashboard, but I decided maybe I better not. But I did take a picture of the gas pump. And basically, a plane is your car. Our ranchers at home don't have planes, except rich people that have them for playthings. But our regular ranchers don't. And just things like getting supplies. Just about all our ranchers are within 3 hours of driving into town to get supplies.
So if you were to, and this would probably be my last question to you in this particular area, if you were to consider what you've seen as far as on property goes, do you think that the vastness of the operation and the sustainability that we all look to achieve out of these operations, do you think we're reasonably matched up at the moment?
Well, I was pretty pleased with what I saw. I saw a few cattle that were thin, but I didn't see any body score ones where it's a bone rack. I would have been throwing a fit if I'd seen that.
Sure.
Pretty much happy with what I've seen. At one of the places that we did a little cattle handling, and it was excellent. The other place they had a little problem with the calf race being too wide, even when they tried to make it narrower, but that's minor. It's pretty pleased, and
Sure.
People seem to have a good attitude. But it was an eye-opener for me.
Mm-hmm.
And what I basically want to make sure is that we make sure we put the correct type of cattle out into Indonesia. I don't want to see, there's certain American lines of cattle I do not want to see on those concrete slabs. They will be in trouble.
Well, I won't get into that area of breed and breed society, because in Australia you can find yourself almost sort of, you're virtually thrown out of the industry if you criticise one against the other.
I'm not naming them, except for Holstein, and I can give you umpty-ump journal article references on lameness and reproductive problems in Holstein, and I have it all in my book, Improving Animal Welfare, A Practical Approach. You can order it online. Came out in 2015, and I've got all the data in there, so if I'm going to bash Holsteins, I've got a whole lot of journal articles to back me up. And the beef breeds I don't think I'm going to name so much, but I went to the Denver Stock Show, and I saw awful post-legged bulls that aren't going to be able to walk on a pasture. They got great carcass traits, but they got lousy feet.
Yep. Well, it's an amazing situation in this audience here and in this industry generally in the north. You're talking to rusted-on Bos Indicus, either breeders or those who have a Bos Indicus base in their herd. And I suppose, in summary, what we need in this industry is a Bos Indicus content.
Oh, you're going to have Bos Indicus content.
And it has to be sufficient to at least...
I heard that other talk. They talked about and this is from the other talk I got this, the Angus sire was a true terminal sire. Mm-hmm. I heard that talk. That's quoting the other talk. He dies.
Well, I won't go there on that
But
one.
that's what the other speaker said.
Oh, okay.
That came from the other talk, and I took notes on that talk.
Well, you better watch out, whoever that was.
That's right. No, but that's what he said.
Yep.
And there's scientific paper on this. Black cattle get hotter. No question about that. Just like black vehicles get hotter.
Sure. So, did you have anything else that I've missed that you wanted to touch on?
I want to talk about audit.
In Australia, at least, for the moment.
Well, then I've got some generalities I want to talk about. I pretty well talked about the critical control points.
Yep.
And I was watching this program here on the audits. And what I've learned on supply chain management, you got 3 legs like on the photographic tripod. If a tripod doesn't have 3 legs, it falls over. And I make a point I sit on planes and I read. That's what I do on planes. I don't play games, I read. And I read the business, and I take like 3 business magazines with me. And I've read about supply chain disasters, big disasters, like the clothing factory that fell down and killed 1,000 people, another clothing factory burned up 100 people, the Baxter blood thinner scandal that killed a whole pile of people. And in every one of those cases, one of the legs on the tripod is missing. And when I worked on implementing the McDonald's audits, and for the most part, McDonald's is a really good school of supply chain management, you have the internal audits, just like you're suggesting here, where each facility would do all the measurements. Then you have a third-party independent auditing company going around checking. And then corporate, which would be some McDonald's supply chain manager going around checking. You've got to have 3 legs. Now, it looks like, and look at your system here, you got the 2 legs in the new system you're proposing. You still need government in there as the 3rd leg checking on stuff. Because where these big failures were, like that factory that burned up and killed all those ladies, they weren't doing their corporate audits. And they got caught. They said, "Ooh, we didn't buy any clothes there." But the activists got in and found the receipts in the office, which happened not to burn. And that brings up another thing. I mean, 2011 was like a horrible time for you. But look at how you've improved. Heat softens steel. This is saying, I've worked for years with metal fabrication. Heat softens steel, and then I can bend it into pretty grill work. But we want to make sure we bend it into pretty grill work, because sometimes the activists make us do something stupid. But what has made some of the changes at home was some of the activist pressure, some of the videos that came out. Because there's maybe it's a 4th leg on the tripod. It's this. This didn't exist 5 years ago. Catch you doing something you shouldn't be doing. And there's a little drone over there. It's going to fly over and catch you doing something too.
Fantastic. If I could sort of jump across the water at the moment and go to Indonesia, where you've seen some of the facilities and some of the supply chain there, if we could call it that. Give us your view on what you saw. Let's start at the feedlot. I don't think you were able to see cattle.
I did not see any transport.
No, you weren't.
I didn't see any transport, so I can't comment on that.
That's okay.
I saw cattle in the feed yards, and basically I was pretty pleased with what those cattle looked like, except for a few dirty pens that needed to be cleaned. That's something they can easily do. Then I saw cattle when they brought over to the slaughterhouse. They looked fine. Now the issue comes up about non-stunned slaughter. It's a controversial issue. I've done a lot of work on non-stunned slaughter because in the U.S. they have very strict rules that protect religious freedom. So I was hired to take out some really dreadful systems and put in really nice upright restraint systems with really good controls where you're not putting too much pressure on the animal. And I was in a situation where I had to figure out how to make it work. And what I have found on slaughter without stunning, to get to an acceptable level of animal welfare, requires much more attention to detail of procedure than regular slaughter. You have to have a calm animal coming in, hold it in a low-stress manner. I prefer upright restraint. Once you get the animal's head in the head holder, cut the animal quickly. If it vocalizes in the restrainer, then you're either squeezing it too hard or something's hurting it. Another thing you need to be doing on measurement is collapse time scoring, or if you're using an inverted box, eye rollback time, because those are indicators of when the animal starts to lose consciousness. Also, your knife that you use got to pass a paper test. This is not an A4 piece of paper. This is a piece of a U.S. paper. But take a piece of paper out of your printer, you hold it like that, and your knife should just be able to go slice, and you do that with a dry knife. And it's also important to use a long enough knife so you're not hacking into the throat like that. And you can greatly improve the animal welfare during non-stun slaughter. You know, if you get sloppy in procedure, things can go really bad really quickly. So I want to put a measurement system in. I'm all about outcome measures. I prefer an upright box, but there are some inverted boxes that will pass this audit. No more than 5 cattle out of 100, 5% vocalizing mooing when they're in that box or entering that box. And I don't judge the intensity of the moo. He's either silent or he makes a sound. electric jigger use, animals falling down in the lead-up race. These are all things that would get them excited. And then I want to measure time to loss of posture, or collapse time, or time to eye rollback, to an indicator that they're going unconscious quickly, and when they roll the animal out of the box, it better not get up. And I can measure that too. You know, I am a believer in measuring things, and then I can tell, am I getting better or am I getting worse? It's important to measure things. Imagine what the highway would be like. Police never measured speeding.
So, excuse me. So, Temple, give us some wisdom on the action of stunning and the outcome of stunning. Give us your thoughts there.
Well, on captive bolt stunning, either penetrating or non-penetrating, if it's done correctly, it's instantly made unconscious. There's a lot of scientific literature on that. I have it in my book. It's also on the Humane Slaughter Association site. I have it on Grandin.com. You know, a lot of the references, you know, it instantly will make the animal unconscious. And that's really important. Now, one of the questions that got brought up in Indonesia was, does a captive bolt kill the animal? Now, usually, in the ancient times, before anybody understood physiology, people considered the heart the center of life. When the heart stops beating, you die. Now, when you shoot an animal with a captive bolt, either penetrator or non-penetrator, the heart will continue to beat for a couple of minutes, or about 2 minutes. So then you cut the throat, it's dying by the slaughter. And a question came up about damage to the brainstem by an anatomy professor in Indonesia, and the non-penetrator would not cause physical damage to the brainstem. A penetrator does, but a non-penetrator doesn't get down that far.
And so, do you have any particular biases in favour of one or the other?
On biases on favor of what to compare to the other?
Sorry, stun versus non-stun.
Well, stun slaughter is much easier to do and have really high level of welfare, and they instantly go unconscious. You know, non-stun slaughter consciousness is not instantaneous. So my standpoint on it is that welfare can be kept at an acceptable level, but it requires much more attention to details of procedure. And
for non-stun.
Non-stun.
Yes, yeah.
Non-stun requires more attention to details of procedure. And when I worked with this, you know, installing this restraint box, and we had a really good rabbi. I mean, really good. This was kosher slaughter with a big, long, special kosher knife, which really does work better than some knife you get out of the knife catalog. And I'd hold the animal really loosely in the restrainer, you know, and he could pull his head out of the head holder if he wanted to. And he didn't. And I'm like standing there working the restrainer, and I'm going, wow, I can't believe this. He doesn't seem to act like he feels it. And I wrote that up in 1994 in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association. I've had some people that say that couldn't possibly be true. There's a much more recent study that was done in New Zealand by Gibson, showed that it did hurt. But there were some differences with the knife. The knife might have been too short. It was not a kosher knife, and it had been sharpened on a mechanical grinder, which might have made a rougher blade. And I've seen slaughter without stunning. It was a total mess. Live animals walking around in the plant. But I've also seen it done well. Okay.
So if we've sort of moved forward to the plant, just go back a step to the feedlot. Yeah. The activities you've seen there, I mean, we can go on forever about the industry and all sorts of activities within it. But what were the areas you would see that need improvement both in feedlots and both in Australia?
Well, dirty pens was one of the ones in the feed yard. Now, I did not observe any handling in Indonesia. I looked at the handling facilities. They were older design. There might be some problems with slippery floors in the handling facility. It was reasonably well maintained. These cattle look gentle. They'll probably go through it. One of the things I've tried to do when I'm doing welfare, yes, I design cattle handling facilities. But I'm not going to tell anybody they got to have my cattle handling facilities, because I went out to one of the properties and they had an older facility, which probably you don't want to copy, but they made it work and work in a perfectly acceptable manner. So I didn't see how they handled cattle, and I didn't see the transport vehicles. Sure. Now, one thing I did see is carcasses hung up in the chiller at one of the big plant that I went to, and I looked for bruising. And if you have an animal get down in a truck and the other cattle walk over the top of it, it will have bruises all over it. You see, that's another outcome measure that you can do to monitor transport, is are we getting some carcasses in with bruises over, major portions of the body of the animal. And I did not see that. It's a small sample, and the animal rights people are going to say, well, you just saw the good places, but it shows it is possible to slaughter cattle in Indonesia with good level of animal welfare.
Sure.
And the feed yards, they looked good.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of those cattle I saw in those Indonesian feed yards, they got better welfare than some of our dairy cows have got. We've got some dairy cows with horrendous welfare, and some of it's genetic, and some of it's poor management of the housing.
Right. Okay. So, stepping forward from that point, we've been from the paddock to the feedlot to the abattoir. Let's go on to the most important person in the chain, and that's the consumer. Now, obviously, in this case, in the live export trade, the consumer is
overseas.
That's right, and in this case, in Indonesia, I don't think anybody who's visited Indonesia, if they have and they haven't been to a wet market, well, then they've missed part of the experience.
Oh, yes, we went to a
Tell us what you
disgusting, foul, disgusting wet market. It was like make you gag. And we walked in there, they'd finished selling most of the meat, and this one guy was asleep on one of these disgusting meat tables. But there were some animals in that wet market that had good welfare. There was like 3 or 4 goats running around eating the leftover produce, and they looked just fine.
Well, the most amazing thing about wet markets all around the world is that virtually every nation that eats meat either still has major wet markets or still has them in a lesser capacity and have graduated steadily into the processed beef marketplace.
Where you're getting away from that, because one of the plants I went to made those meatballs.
Buxo balls.
Yes,
yep.
And I ate one right off the processing line.
Uh-huh.
And that's not going to a wet market. I don't think they sell those in the
No, they're
wet market.
They're more so the people's food in the street. That's my interpretation. Yeah.
Well,
it's wider than that, but that's part of it.
And the other, improved cattle genetics will give you more boxer balls, but it's probably not going to increase the quality of them any. They put a lot of tapioca in them. They were very chewy.
Did you have an opportunity at all to see any of the supermarket facilities, or not so much facilities? The supermarket outlets, I should say.
Yes, I did.
We
went in a supermarket, and looked good.
Yep, sure.
There's some people that are buying their meat there.
For sure.
Yeah, I did see that.
So let me at this point, in the interest of time and obviously I would have thought the desire to ask questions, are there questions from the audience to Temple on anything she's talked about or you'd like to know about?
Maybe I'm going to pick somebody. I see somebody there with a pink shirt on. Okay, right there.
Got the question here. It's Mauro, is it? Yeah, Mauro. It's Mauro Balzerini, yeah. Sorry, Mauro.
Mauro Balzerini from Wellard. When can we have the pleasure of showing you some of our shipping vessels and get your opinion on the welfare during the sea transport?
Well, I looked at ships in the early 80s, one fairly nice one and one really disgusting rust bucket. And the thing I've noticed, just looking at the pictures of the ships, and I know something about mechanical engineering, you got some heavy-duty ventilation equipment on those ships that was not there when I looked at ships in the early 80s.
Yep.
And you get it ventilated enough, it dries the waste up. One of the things I would evaluate coming off the ship is, are the cattle clean? If you haven't been cleaning the pens or ventilating it right, they're going to be covered in you-know-what.
Yep.
I did not get to see that. I know that the loading can be done decently. I saw that in 1980. Loading of ships can be done right. I've seen cattle put onto ships in Hawaii. They put them in converted shipping containers, which I don't think is as good as what you're doing. Fortunately, as far as Indonesia goes, it's a fairly short voyage.
Go ahead, Matt.
I just want to finish off by leaving you an open invitation whenever you got time or the will to do it. Just let us know, and you are most welcome to do an assessment on that.
Well, thank you very, very much. And basically, you manage the stuff you measure, and my approach is there's certain things I'm going to measure, handling, scoring, things like dirty cattle, body condition, lameness, heat stress, open mouth breathing, things like that are critical control points. And I was pleased to see that most of those things were high up on your list from that survey.
Sure. Other questions? Yes, I've got one just in the middle here.
Hi, Temple. We spoke last night a little bit. My interest is more in a direct comparison to what you've seen when you were showing the footage back in 2011. I think you've pretty much covered the stunning side of it and given your information on that. I'm interested in what you thought of the stock work and the yard work leading up to the slaughter boxes or the lairages that are in the Indonesian abattoirs now.
Well, they were just pretty plain and ordinary, but they seem to work. I mean, fortunately, a lot of these cattle are pretty gentle because they've been kept in indoor buildings. People are walking through them all the time, and we went to big abattoir, and then we went to a real little small one, and there was just some square pens in there, and it's pretty simple setup, but it seemed to be adequate. I want to just bring up one other thing. What would you rather have? Would you rather have a state-of-the-art facility with bad management, or have something that's at least adequate, but it's got good management? I would say that those facilities that were adequate with good management. Now, compared to the dreadful videos from 2011, it's light years improved compared to those awful videos. In fact, when I saw those videos 2011, and I saw your logo on that dreadful thing you had there to restrain the cattle, and I about fell off my chair. There's been
So did we, Temple. We were lying on the floor with you, I can assure you. Further questions? There's one just here.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't see for the light who it is.
Thanks for being here, Temple. We've been waiting a while to hear your opinion. My name's Cameron McDonald, and I was, I suppose, at the coalface in Indonesia when I was the livestock export manager up there, just as the market shut. I arrived there 6 months before. So my role there was to continue to improve animal welfare, but still implement the Mark 1 boxes, which at the time of the Mark 4 of the Four Corners show was obviously painted as quite a negative tool, but in the 20 years that we've been working there, it was definitely a progression through to where we are now.
Well, it's probably better than what was there beforehand.
Exactly. So
manhandle them, wrestle them down.
I understand from your trip here, and we will continue to see it probably in the papers and the media, that you were only taken to places of a high quality. But my point here is that being on the coalface then, those well-managed places were already still operating in Indonesia well before the Four Corners show. So my point to anyone who's bringing that topic to me is that Four Corners chose to show only the worst of what was happening in Indonesia, and it was an opportunity now for us as an industry to show you the good, positive things that are happening in Indonesia, and that for me, being on the ground, is really just to say that management was already happening a long time, and the industry has been progressing at a very fast pace. And I think by having you now to see the good side of it, I'm hoping that you'll be able to walk away.
And it's my understanding that you've gotten quite a high level of using the stunner, which I think is really a good thing. And what's happening at home, our big plants now have got really strict closed circuit camera over the internet, auditors over the internet, auditing the stunning area, auditing the truck unloading. And the thing that some of our companies, Cargill's doing that, JBS has been doing that in the U.S., is stunning was so dependent on gun maintenance that didn't change, but cattle handling there were certain people that just wouldn't put the electric jigger away, and they had to remove about 10% of the people handling cattle. They just were rough with them, and that's one of the things learned from the TV cameras. Cattle handling, things like that, transport, constant management.
Yeah, and mine wasn't a question; it was just to thank you for coming and getting to see both sides of the story and be able to make your own.
Well, the
judgment
thing that really struck me, especially going out to the stations, I mean, it's a vastness out there that just blew my mind. And I don't know, we do need to feed people in the world. We got to raise food on that land, and crops are not going to be doing it there.
So, do I have any other questions around the room? No?
Well, I'm going to be around all this afternoon, and then Sharon and I are taking the red eye to Sydney tonight.
Just stick around for 2 seconds, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, sorry, everybody. So, look, I think we'll close the session here now. As Temple mentioned, she's going to be around, which is great. So that'll be a further opportunity to do some one-on-one questioning. Just, I guess, Temple, in closing, we do, as Cameron said, thank you very much for taking the time out of what I know is a very busy life for yourself in your own country to come and give an independent view of what you've seen.
Well, I learned a lot on this. It was a very, very interesting trip for me. I'm really glad that I was able to come.
Fantastic.
And this brings up another thing of, okay, you're just being there a few days. You can't say that's the same as working in the field. But I think on a lot of problems, we've got one problem we have in my country, and I think it's going to be worse than your country. I was interested to see on that survey that 11% of the public had a friend or knew somebody in the export industry. That would not be true at home. In the U.S., people are much more removed from agriculture. And what worries me is we got policymakers, they get degrees in things like political science, they'll go to work for a congressman, then they go to work for a lobbying company, and they make policy on stuff where it's all an abstraction. And they've never been in the field. And this applies to just everything. Another issue, and I think the internet makes this worse, is it makes radical right bigger, radical left a bigger voice, radical right a bigger voice, and then the middle just gets trashed. But we need to have people in the middle figure out sensible things to do. And I had the interesting experience back when I was implementing the McDonald's program in 1999 to take high-up executives on their first trips to farms and slaughter plants. And when things went well, they were happy. But I remember the day when they saw a half-dead dairy cow go in their product. It was a true undercover boss moment, just like that show, Undercover Boss. And they go, whoa, there's some things we got to change here. And then I learned about some other executives that went to a coffee plantation, and there was some very bad treatment of workers. And they're going, oh, whoa, there's a problem here. Those figures became real. I call it dragging the suits out of the office. There was an article in one of our business magazines, and a helicopter took the CEO, the brand new CEO, over the top of a big power plant. And he looks down at it and he goes, I'm in charge of all of that? This big, complicated thing I don't understand? You see, then it's no longer an abstraction. And I think a big problem around the world, in the developed world, is policy getting what I call abstractified, where maybe they'd never get out in the field.
Let me assure you, you don't have it all to yourself in America. That's about the one thing I can assure you of, Temple. It's not just common to the US. But look, thank you again, Temple. We have two very compatible industries in this particular countries, at least in this industry. One is Australia with its vastness and its production. The other is Indonesia with its use of byproducts, and Indonesia in this case, but other countries is included, that take up the product that we produce, which is livestock, and then turn it into a higher degree of high-quality protein,
It was real
utilising
interested
labour along
in
the
the
way.
talks on integrating cattle into the palm oil plantations. That was a real interest to me.
So let me before you go, let me just offer you a token of appreciation from the industry. Thank you, Temple. This
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you very, very much.
That's your sleeping pill for the trip home.
Okay, my sleeping pill for the trip home. I'm going to need one. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.